course, the other way of looking at this is, because it is a systemic problem and because it affects the poorest people in society, to what extent could we maybe think of a world in which it's not so much the push of consumption from the West that is implicated in the causing or the perpetuating of slavery, but it's the actual regions, Southeast Asia you've mentioned, the Philippines you've mentioned, Pakistan, India, that actually have an economy that grows to a level where there may be a distribution of wealth that prevents that from happening. I really think that sounds a bit utopian, but what are your thoughts?
Well, if you think that we can't manage to solve that problem in the West, even though we've got very clear and very often well-made legislations, it tells you how difficult it will be to do it over there. For instance, if you look in Italy, but I know that it happens in Spain, in Greece as well, with all the immigrants coming, and with the fact that a lot of them are not officially allowed to stay, so inevitably they end up working. For instance, in Italy, we have a big problem in the south of Italy, where illegal immigrants end up working effectively like slaves in agriculture. And again, it's the local mafia that sort of manages the whole business, intercepts these people who are in a very fragile kind of position, because they cannot go to the authorities, because otherwise they will be sent back home, and they need to make a living. And so they end up working in these agricultural businesses, working crazy hours in really impossible kind of situations, paid nothing, and living in shacks or tents or really impossible kind of situations, and we know it. I mean, it's not something that it's hidden away somewhere else in the world. We are in the heart of Europe. The laws are very clear, etc., and yet we are not able to solve that problem. Again, there are lots of organizations that try and sort of reach these people and help them and make the authorities apply the laws. But again, when you have a criminal organization that are so powerful to have contacts within the government, and that manage to escape any kind of consequence, they may pay a fine. Some people may end up in jail, but business goes on as usual. So yes, theoretically, we could solve the problem, and the laws and regulations, both nationally and internationally, are there. If they were applied strictly and precisely, the problem would probably not disappear, but it certainly wouldn't be at the level it is today. But unless I mean, if every citizen in a country were to demand their governments to do something about it and apply these laws, that would certainly help. But when you find that in the mentality of most people in Europe, these illegal immigrants, I mean, should be just either sent back or let to drown in the sea. It's not as if you're going to have much support from people. There's no sympathy for immigrants, etc. And people like Italians, for instance, have completely forgotten that they went through the same kind of situation when they were the illegal immigrants somewhere else. Unfortunately, it would take an incredible shift in awareness and conscience in people to get to a real solution. The laws are there because effectively, I mean, most European country, most Western country has a legislation that is fairly clear and strict regarding slavery or exploitation of work, etc. It would just be a matter of applying those laws.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got to change the culture.
Yes, we need to change the culture. And I'm wondering to what extent degrowth is the viable option, or rather, maybe I should phrase it in the following way. You have a young son. What are you telling young people about these issues, if anything at all? Because I suspect on one hand, knowing these things would be damaging to mental health in general. Having too many problems that can't be solved must be a weight on a young person's mind. But then...
No, I don't think it is a weight. I think if certain issues are presented to children in a very clear and objective way as facts when they are young, then they grow up making better decisions without any kind of, I don't know, in terms of my son, for instance, it's quite a peculiar case because he was with me most of the time. I took him with me to many developing countries whenever I was in places that weren't dangerous. And he saw the reality. He saw things that were a bit shocking for him at first sight. I mean, because it obviously for a kid who was growing up in London, finding himself in places where he could see that children didn't have anything, or but I think it simply gave him more tools for understanding, a better view of the fact that there isn't one reality, there are many realities, and that knowing it enables you to make better choices. So, for instance, my son is very strict in the way he behaves. And I mean, it's very conscious about the food he eats and the clothes he wears. He doesn't buy, it's even too much. I mean, it's very radical in that. He grows his own food. He wears only second-hand clothes made of natural materials that are locally produced. I mean, this kind of things. It's very, very, he's better than me in that sense. But I think that's just the result of having accumulated more information without any judgment, simply seeing reality. Because one of the problems is that most of us in the West live in a total bubble. We are really removed from reality. And the recent generations are even more removed from reality than, let's say, my generation. So let's say that there was a time when people didn't know anything because they were born in a place, they grew up in that place, they lived in that place. They never saw anything of the world, and they only heard vague and usually manipulated news about the rest of the world. But in the last century, we've gained access to information, and so there was a progressive widening of our horizons. But then in the last 20 years, unfortunately, I think that process has almost reversed. And despite the fact that we never had so much easy and free access to information, we are now at a stage where this amount of information is almost useless because it's too much, it's difficult to absorb, it's very often confused and difficult to decipher and know what's true and what's not. And people just, I don't know, I have the impression that people now are, let's say, at 20 years old now is generally less aware of the world than at 20 years old 50 years ago when I was young. And that is, well, personally, I find it a big disappointment because I was one of the people involved in the beginning of digital technology application to communication, etc. And like most people in those years, we were absolutely convinced that the use of internet, the access to information, etc., would have made a huge difference and would have made everybody more aware of reality, better informed, and as a consequence, we said, well, automatically things will get better. And now we know that we were absolutely wrong. We were very optimistic, and yes, it could have gone that way theoretically, but we didn't take into account the certain elements of human nature, of greed and short-sightedness, and the result is what we see now. So it's that I find a big disappointment. I still think that we because of the incredible tools that we've got at our disposal now, we could make things much better. We've got all the knowledge and the technology, but again, without a shift in culture, without a shift in attitude, it's very difficult. So I remember in the late 60s when there were lots of scientists and researchers who were foreseeing what would have happened if we hadn't changed course in terms of climate change, in terms of society, etc. And no one wanted to listen because all they were saying was that we should have reduced our growth. We should have been more frugal, more sensible. And if you think of it, in those days, those people were working out theories. They didn't have the tools we have now. Nowadays, every student with a computer and an internet connection can do a lot of really good research. They can access masses of data that are publicly available through the international organizations. They can use modeling tools that can really allow to foresee what's going to happen. And so I think it is important to encourage young people to do that. But in terms of that problem, that psychological problem, what do we do with growth or degrowth? That is it's tricky because we've been so used to the idea that we can only grow, we can only have more, and everything is being connected to the material aspect of it. So we can have more, we can consume more, we can produce more, and I think that is it's a real trap because it disregards completely the consequences, the long-term consequences, and so I think one extremely important element is to convince people that they have to start thinking long term, because otherwise there's no way that we're going to get out of it. The idea of degrowth is, I think, a bit unrealistic. I mean, it's against human nature, and even though the people who advocate that the fact that we should consume less, produce less, and go back to local economy, etc., they've got plenty of reasons. But I really can't imagine how a world, which is now a globalized world, can go back to, I mean, you can do it on a small scale, on a local scale, but in terms of the world, I think the idea of going back, it's not practicable. It's not feasible at all. At the same time, all those people, particularly politicians and the media, that say that we can find a different way of growing, making growth sustainable, again, are disregarding the reality. Because, I mean, very often when people talk about sustainability, especially politicians, they talk about how to make the way we live sustainable, which is not the point. I mean, we cannot make the way we live sustainable. We've got to change the way we live. But because politicians are only, again, necessarily interested in the short term, because they want to show immediate results, because people want immediate results, because they're not used to thinking long terms, then they make choices that look like they're good, and they make and they obtain some immediate result, but the downside is that very often those results have terrible consequences. I mean, we have a really obvious case in India when in the late 60s, the government realized that the population was growing exponentially and that soon there wouldn't have been food enough for everybody. So they said, well, this is unsustainable. So what is the sustainable solution? And they started policies to increase food production. They did so by incrementing the use of genetically modified crops. These genetically modified crops required a huge amount of pesticides and fertilizers and water. They were successful because, in fact, in a matter of 20 years, they managed to provide food for a population that was growing enormously. So, yes, they made something unsustainable, the growth of population, sustainable because they produce food. The result is now that India has a level of pollution that is incredible. The number of people who are dying of cancers and other illnesses related to pollution is huge. The soils are depleted because monocultures and the use of fertilizers have had terrible consequences. The use of pesticides reduced all the natural factors that were balancing the environment, so the environment is in a dreadful state. The use of water has depleted all the sources, and so they've got to dig wells that are deeper and deeper. But deeper wells cost more money to build, and they need bigger pumps, which are more expensive and consume more fuel. And so there's a huge number of Indian farmers who commit suicide now because it's something really scary, the number of suicides, because they had to borrow more and more money to buy the seeds, to buy the pesticides, the fertilizers, the pumps, etc. On top of that, climate change has reduced the snow and ice on the Himalayas, which are the source of all the water in India. And so the two things, but all these things combined, resulted in a total disaster, which all derives from the inability to think long-term and think in a systemic way. Because we have a perfect model in nature. In nature, every single element is connected to everything else. If we don't start applying that principle, that way of thinking, to any decision that we make locally or globally, small things or big things, there is no way that we can create anything that is sustainable. It's a fact. But again, if it doesn't start, I mean, I don't think we can expect people, particularly poor people, uneducated people in developing countries, to make that kind of choices. As you were saying before, we in the West, we can decide as consumers to make some choices, and if enough people do it, that may make a difference. But we are but a tiny fraction of the world population. The greatest part of the world population is still uneducated and can only think, and it's totally understandable, can only think of surviving another day. You can't ask them to make choices which imply reducing their income or something like that. It's just not feasible. So unless the world decides that if we want to get out of it, or if we want to survive as a species on the planet, then we've got to implement certain policies. I don't think we'll get anywhere. But if you look at all the international agreements, like from Kyoto to Paris, Copenhagen, Rio, the results are really disappointing, because the influence of multinational corporations is by now so great. I mean, some of them are much more powerful than governments, that all these decisions that are taken by governments in these international meetings have to take into account, make loads of compromises and take into account the interests of the corporations. And so, I mean, the goals that they set are insufficient by themselves. And then the way in which these agreements are put into practice is even more insufficient. Sometimes I think that a real change could only come if something really disastrous happened. And so people are forced to accept that we cannot continue the way we are. I was hoping that COVID could have had partly that kind of effect, but judging by what's happening, I'm not sure.